All right, so good afternoon, everyone. So, welcome to the Open Security Summit July session. So, we're on our third day today. So, we want to welcome our speaker, Sam Stepanyan, and he'll be talking about using OWASP Nettacker for recon and vulnerability scanning. So, over to you, Sam.
Okay, thank you very much. Just let me share my screen. Can you see my screen okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So, hi everyone. My name is Sam Stepanyan. You can find me on Twitter at SecureStep9. I usually tweet about a lot of interesting news and stuff around application security. So please do follow me if you're not following me already. I'm an OWASP chapter leader and I'm OWASP Nettacker project co-leader. And today I'm going to talk to you about using OWASP Nettacker project on Recon and vulnerability scanning. So a little bit more about me. So as I mentioned, I'm OWASP London chapter leader and also OWASP chapter committee chair. But I do come from software development background, and I'm an application security consultant working in financial services in the City of London. So I am a defender. So why am I presenting a talk about a tool which consists of words network and attacker, while I'm an application guy and I'm a defender? So I have an interesting history with OWASP Nettacker because I first tried Nettacker in 2017 when this project first popped into the list of OWASP projects. I saw the name. I thought, okay, Nettacker maybe means network attacker. Let's try to attack a network. I launched it. The tool responded with lots of lists of some options, which I didn't understand and didn't have any time to investigate further. So I just abandoned it for a while. However, little did I know that later on I will have to meet this project again because next year, in following year in 2018, Dr. Greg Fracos, who was my chapter co-leader at the time, and myself, we were asked to demonstrate OWASP Nettacker at Black Hat Europe 2018 conference. And this was because Nettacker project's original leaders couldn't get to London in time because, as you know, there's a Black Hat USA conference happening in Las Vegas every year, but there's also a Black Hat Europe conference happening in London in December every year. So we said, okay, fine. If you cannot present, you don't want to lose the slot, we will happily present your project because it's an OWASP project at Black Hat conference. But we knew nothing about Nettacker. So we got on a Zoom session just like this one, and we had to learn this tool overnight, and we absolutely loved it. And the morning after at Black Hat conference, Dr. Greg Fracos and I, we presented the tool, and then suddenly this happened. We had a huge crowd of people gathering around our stand looking at the demo, and there's our penetration testers, security engineers, DevOps engineers, consultants, all sorts of people suddenly expressing their interest in the tool. And everybody liked it, and we liked it as well, and we liked it so much that I became a project co-leader, and we decided to present it the following year in 2019, and then even bigger crowds of people gather around looking at the demonstration, and I'm going to demonstrate this tool to you today as well. So what is OWASP Nettacker and why is it so popular with penetration testers? Because first of all, OWASP Nettacker, just like all OWASP projects, it's an open source software tool, and it is built to assist with penetration testing by automating your recon or information gathering tasks and vulnerability scanning tasks. Because it is written in Python, it can be run on Windows, Linux, Mac OS, or basically anything which can run Python. OWASP Nettacker does not use any other external tools because it's written in 100% Python, and that's all that it needs to run. Another very important thing to mention about Nettacker is that it was accepted as a Google Summer of Code project. And if you don't know what Google Summer of Code is, it is an initiative by Google, which is basically a paid internship for students who wish to spend their summer break working on an open source project. And yeah, if you know a student, please let them know, because the way how this works is students apply to enhance or improve an open source project participating in this program. Of course, OWASP participates, but there are lots of other organizations which work in open source, which participate in Google Summer of Code. And basically, students work on an open source project under the mentorship of mentors who are usually the maintainers of that open source project. In our case, it will be OWASP project leaders. And then they get paid. And OWASP participates in Google Summer of Code every year. We're very lucky that we had quite a few students working on this project. So this is what's very unusual about this tool, because it is actually written and enhanced by students. So what is OWASP Nettacker? OWASP Nettacker is a bit of a like Swiss Army knife kind of tool. So just like a Swiss Army knife, it's a tool consisting of many tools, which are not necessarily compatible with each other, but can they be used together? Can you pull out several blades out of Swiss Army knife and use them at the same time? So with Nettacker, you can. So just like a Swiss Army knife, Nettacker is a collection of tools or modules. So it has modular structure. It's easy to create your own modules for Recon tasks or for vulnerability scanning tasks. It's quite fast because it's using Python multi-threading model, and it's actually quite gentle in terms of how you can scale its performance speed, because it's all configurable from the command line. It also has something called customizable profile. So that's bundle of modules that are focused on a specific task. But you can automate and run it from command line, which is very important for this kind of tool. So a little caveats that OWASP Nettacker is not officially released yet. It's not even in beta quality. The current versions in use are 0.0.2 and 0.0.3. We are looking for more contributors. And if you know Python, then please do help us to improve the tool. I will have information on how to contribute at the end of this presentation. However, the great things about this tool is that it already has a command line interface. It has a web UI, web user interface. It has an API. It has a report generator. It also has something called Maltego transforms. Those of you who use Kali Linux probably familiar with the tool used for a lot of cybersecurity investigations called Maltego, and Nettacker integrates with that. And it also has over 70 different modules. So where can you find Nettacker? Nettacker, like an OWASP, all OWASP projects can be found on OWASP website. That's the URL for it. And it's very important to notice that the documentation for OWASP Nettacker is actually on GitHub under GitHub Wiki tab. So we actually utilize the GitHub Wiki for Nettacker documentation. And for example, installation instructions can be found on the wiki. And there's a navigation on the right-hand side when you click on the wiki tab in OWASP Nettacker GitHub repository. So the question that I'm being asked a lot is, what is the difference between Nettacker and other scanners? Because of course there are other scanners, including OWASP Zap, which is probably one of the most popular vulnerability scanners out there, which is open source. So the difference is that uh, other scanners like Burp Suite or OWASP Zap, they work by scanning one website for many web application vulnerabilities, whatever the scanner is able to find. So it will crawl the website, just one website, and it will try to discover all URLs, all forms, all parameters, all buttons, and it will try to fuzz everything, click on everything, and then give you a report of any vulnerabilities that it discovered. Now, OWASP Nettacker works differently because it is built to scan one or many, and that could be hundreds or thousands of IP addresses, networks, or subdomains, and what it scans them for open ports, and also one or more specific vulnerabilities which are listed by the users. And you can bundle those modules, vulnerability in modules. So that is the biggest difference, that the user defines what vulnerability is looking for, and on all the subdomains or all the IP addresses or lots of networks, and that is the biggest difference. Okay, let's talk about how to install OWASP Nettacker. So OWASP Nettacker can be found on GitHub. So today in this token for demonstration, I will use version 002, which is a previous version of OWASP Nettacker, because the latest version 003 currently has a couple of issues because we've changed the architecture of the tool and made lots of changes in the way how it works. And as a result, it might be a little bit user unfriendly at the moment, but we are working on that right now with Google Summer of Code students. So hopefully by September, version 003 will be a bit more usable, but I will use the previous version. So first of all, if you need to install OWASP Nettacker, you need to install the dependencies first. There are a few libraries that you need to install, and please do read the manual on our wiki page, which we have on GitHub. And generally speaking, if you want to install the latest version, you would just git clone OWASP Nettacker and then use Python's pip tool to install all the prerequisites, all the requirements, and then you run it from the command line. However, I will be showing today version 002, and to install that one, you will have to go to GitHub releases page and then click on version 002 and download the software either in zip format or in gzip format, of course, depending on which platform you're using, Windows or Linux or Mac OS. Another thing about installing Nettacker is because it can be a bit non-trivial for some people, and sometimes dependencies can be a little bit tricky. I've recorded a video which is available on YouTube, and it's called "How to Install OWASP Nettacker on Kali Linux." You can go and check it out and just search "How to Install OWASP Nettacker" on YouTube, and that's video will hopefully come up, and it will guide you how to install it. Another interesting thing about Nettacker that it comes pre-installed on a Linux distribution called Black Arch. For those of you who don't know, Black Arch is a Linux distribution specifically created for penetration testing. And we were very surprised to find out that the maintainers of Black Arch Linux decided to include OWASP Nettacker in their tools. And Nettacker version 002 is bundled with Black Arch automation bundle of modules inside Black Arch. So if you install Black Arch automation set, you will get Nettacker in Black Arch as well for this. Okay, so you can also run it in Docker, which is very useful. And we're trying to get an official OWASP image on OWASP Docker Hub at the moment. It is not available at the moment, but what you can do, you can, once you have Nettacker downloaded and expanded in one of your folders, you can just use Docker Compose up command to create your own Docker container and run it. So before we go any further, one interesting thing to note about OWASP Nettacker, that unlike some other tools, it is actually an offensive security tool. So it's a reminder that you shall not misuse this tool nor any other security tool for unauthorized access. So performing security scans without permission from the owner of the computer system is illegal. Today, I will be using OWASP.org as a target for my demonstrations. That's because OWASP website and OWASP.org participates in bug bounty programs on Bugcrowd, so it specifically allows security researchers to run security scans on its domain. Okay, so in order for you to understand Nettacker, what you need to understand that it contains 3 types of modules. So it can do 3 different types of tasks. So first of all, it can perform scanning tasks. So for example, it can do port scan. So these are all the modules which have scan in their name. Then Nettacker can perform vulnerability scanning, which is, for example, if you want to search for Apache Struts vulnerability, you will use a vulnerability module, so looking for a specific vulnerability. And then the attacker also has modules of type brute or brute forcing. So SSH brute will perform brute forcing over SSH protocol. So this is what makes Nettacker quite an interesting project, because it combines several types of modules and also lots of modules all in one tool, and they're all written in Python. So there is no need to install anything else. Now let's look at Nettacker scan modules. So there are quite a lot of them, so I'm not going to go through all of them. I have highlighted some of them with an asterisk. So for example, admin scan module will scan the target and will try to find any administrative control panels. that might exist on the target. CMS detection scan will try to detect version of content management system on the target. Directory scan is a bit similar to the directory brute forcing, so it will try to find out are there any directories on the target which might contain some sensitive information, such as, for example, .git or .svn directories. PMA scan, also an interesting one. So PMA stands for PHP-MyAdmin. PHP-MyAdmin is a tool which is a web UI to MySQL database. And PHP-MyAdmin tool is used on quite a lot of websites which use MySQL database as a backend. However, the problem with PHP-MyAdmin is that there are a lot of older versions of this administrative system, which is vulnerable to lots of known bugs, known vulnerabilities, and also there are websites which are using quite old version of PHP-MyAdmin where even the authentication was not sorted out properly. So it allows attackers to actually brute force their way into the web UI, which contains the data behind the website, behind the system. So that's why it's quite important. Port scan, I will talk about this. So it's similar to Nmap, which is perform port scanning. Very, very important module of Nettacker is subdomain scan, because subdomain scan is the module which makes Nettacker such a great and unique tool, because it allows users to combine subdomain scanning with all other modules. So it's performing subdomain scans. Another great one is Wapalizer scan. So Wapalizer scan uses Wapalizer tool, and Wapalizer tool allows you to detect what kind of technologies are running on the website, whether they're running a particular version of the, let's say, programming language or framework. So it's quite a useful tool. And for example, WordPress version scan is another useful module which allows you to discover which versions of WordPress are running on the target website, because older versions of WordPress have no vulnerabilities. Here are some Nettacker vulnerability modules. I'm not going to go through all of them. There are some modules which look for specific vulnerability which made huge headlines in the press. So for example, Citrix CVE 2019 19781 was a big vulnerability affecting Citrix devices all over the world at the end of 2019 and January 2020. And so was MS Exchange CVE. This was vulnerability called proxy logon, which last year again made huge headlines all around the world, because there were literally hundreds of thousands of computer systems vulnerable to this zero-day vulnerability, allowing attackers to break in and breach your organization. Few other interesting modules. So for example, server version vuln is the module that I will demonstrate today. This is a very simple vulnerability that indicates that the web server is leaking what it's running in the server banner, because as you know, most web servers, they have a server banner in their response, and that usually will have the name of the web server software and the version. If you haven't hardened it, because usually when you harden your web server, it's recommended to completely remove this header or obfuscate the server version. Another very useful vulnerability module that I use all the time is SSL certificate expired vulnerability. This is great because you can scan your entire network and find out any servers which have expired SSL certificates on them. Why is it useful from the say penetration testing or vulnerability scanning perspective? Is because if you have a server on your network with expired SSL certificate, that means that the server is probably abandoned by your IT department, and because obviously they forgot to renew the certificate. That also means that the server probably is not patched. So that is probably a potential target for attackers, because if the server is not patched, that means that they can try some of the known vulnerabilities from the past to exploit and break in. And another module is X powered by vulnerability. It's another very simple vulnerability, looking at the header called X powered by in service response, because this header usually contains, again, the name of the programming language and the version. For example, it will say, oh, this server is running PHP version 5 or ASP.NET version 2, which are old versions, and obviously that will help um, penetration testers or users of Nettacker to understand if there's anything out of date in the infrastructure. And the last but not least, we have Nettacker brute forcing modules or brute modules. So Nettacker can perform brute forcing using a variety of protocols. So you can use FTP for brute forcing. It can use HTTP basic auth protocol. It can also use HTTP form brute forcing. And the way how it works, when Nettacker visits a website, it will find a form which has fields called username and password. And if these fields are found on the form, these are the ones which will be exploited, because Nettacker will try to submit that form with various combinations of usernames and passwords either provided by the user or read from a dictionary. HTTP NTLM brute forcing performs brute forcing using HTTP NTLM protocol, which, for example, Microsoft IS server uses. SMTP brute forcing will brute force using SMTP protocol or mail protocol. SSH, of course, will perform brute forcing using SSH. We also have Telnet brute forcing, and another very useful and interesting module, WordPress XML RPC brute forcing. So if you have a website running WordPress, there is a feature in its XML RPC component which can be brute forced without going through WordPress's login form. And a lot of people don't know about this and forget to disable XML RPC. And this is how attackers can actually exploit the XML RPC endpoint and brute force credentials. So just a very short slide on IoT Scan, because IoT Scan was the original name for Nettacker, and it's still its Twitter handle. If you try to find Nettacker on Twitter, you will see that it's called IoT Scan, because the project leaders, when they created Nettacker back in 2017, they originally intended to use Nettacker to scan for IoT devices and then scan those IoT devices for open ports. And then, for example, brute force scan for default credentials. I've actually used Nettacker for this kind of use case where I scanned a client's network using the brute force scan for admin credentials, and I discovered lots of devices on the network which responded to admin, and it turns out that these were CCTV cameras. These are all the webcams scattered all around the various premises of this organization, and when people install the CCTV cameras, they forgot to change the default passwords. It was trivial for attackers to just break in and watch what the employees of the organizations are doing on camera. Um, so the important module that the attacker has is the port scanning module, or port scan. So a lot of security researchers will know a tool called Nmap, which is probably #1 tool for port scanning out there. And most people have sort of love and hate relationship with Nmap. To be honest, I stopped using Nmaps since I started using Nettacker, because I find the Nmap a bit confusing to work, because I always need to use a cheat sheet to remember all its various options in the command line. And Nettacker has a port scanning module, which is, I think, much easier to use and faster. You can also control the scanning speed, so you can make it multi-threading by adding -t command and specifying how many threads you want Nettacker to launch for scanning, and also -m parameter, where you can define how many scanning threads you want per host. So if you're scanning a network, for example, 200 servers on it, you can say, okay, you want to launch, for example, 100 threads per each host, and then you specify, I don't know, maybe 50 threads, depending on the amount of memory that you have. Nettacker is using Python's multi-threading, which means that you must understand how multi-threading works, and you must ensure that you have enough CPU and memory parameters if you start bumping up the number of threads when scanning large networks. But because it's configurable, usually it's much, let's say, it's much nicer to a network than default Nmap. By default, Nettacker's port scanner will scan 1,000 most frequently used ports, similar to Nmap. However, of course, it's most useful if you scan specific ports. So if you add the -g parameter to Nettacker, then you will be able to, for example, define the list of ports you want to scan with a dash if you want to specify a range, or with a comma. If, for example, port 80 and port 443, you can just separate them with a comma, and this will also work. Okay, so before I jump into a demo and show you how Nettacker works, it remind us, so when I started this presentation, I talked about that how confused I was when I ran Nettacker for the first time because I didn't understand how to use it. So here is how to use Nettacker. When you run Nettacker, you have to specify two mandatory parameters. -I, which is a target what you want to scan, and -M, which is the module that you want to use for scanning. And for example, if you want to scan just one IP address, 192.168.1.149, that's what you define, and -M, we will define port scan. If you want to scan the whole network, then you just define /24 for the whole subnet. And speaking of the targets, Nettacker's targets are actually quite flexible, which is very good. So as you've seen already, you can define a single IP address as a target for scanning. You can define a range of IP addresses with a starting IP and the ending IP addresses. You can also define the target in CIDR/bits parameter, like this in this format. You can also scan a domain name like OWASP.org. You can also scan a specific URL, and that URL can be with HTTP or HTTPS. So this is how flexible Nettacker is. Of course, if you want to use Nettacker for scanning a large number of targets, for example, most organizations will have a large number of networks, large number of subdomains and IP ranges. What you can do, you can define them all in a text file, and that will be basically one line of text per a target for a network or for a subdomain, and then you can launch the attacker with a list, and then you will, instead of -I parameter, you will specify -L parameter for your file name, and then you can run any module on all the list of targets. So that's running an attacker 101. Let me now do a bit of a demo. So I will demonstrate how to use some of the modules. One of the interesting things about an attacker that you can actually chain them. But let me switch to my Kali Linux here, where I already have Nettacker version 002 pre-installed. Now, as I mentioned, if I run Nettacker without any parameters whatsoever, what happens, it will provide a very long list of its usage. Right, so if I go all the way up, so this is how it starts, then it displays its usage instructions, and there are a lot of various options here, which you might not understand how to use it. But we already know that we need to provide two parameters, right? So we need to define -I, and we need to provide for our target. So let me provide a target, 192.168.132.177 is one of the servers on my network that I want to scan, and I want to perform a port scan. Let's see if this works. So this is how you can launch a port scan on the target. When the attacker starts, it displays its current version and how many modules it loads. And then it will perform the scan, and it will show you, you can see how quickly it scanned the target and showed all the open ports on this particular IP address. Okay, so this is, I think, very good. And you can see how simple it was to understand. And for example, if we wanted to scan just for one particular port, I could have defined the -G parameter and say, okay, I only want to scan for a port 22 and just confirm if one port is open. And you can do it across the whole network. In this case, I only use one host. So there you go. So that is how it can be used. So that's using it with one parameter. Now let me show you how we can use it on a domain. So let's choose OWASP.org, which I'm allowed to scan. Again, just to remind everyone that the OWASP.org participates in bug bounty, so security researchers are allowed to scan, but please be aware and do not scan networks for which you do not have permission. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to first run a server version vulnerability module like this. And we can see that the results are that there is a port 443 open and port 80 open. And on both these ports, the server version header comes up with Cloudflare. So it doesn't provide any version. So the server is Cloudflare. Okay, this is already interesting. So the next thing that I want to show you is subdomain scan. So now I want to scan the whole OWASP.org domain and find all subdomains of OWASP.org. So I'm now going to use subdomain scan module. So this is now going to use passive methods. So it's not actually going to connect to anything. It's using various databases such as certificate transparency. You can see how quickly it discovered all the subdomains of OWASP.org, quite a few of them. Okay. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you how I can combine subdomain scan with, for example, server version val module, which I already showed to you. There is a shortcut called -s. So if I provide -s, that means use subdomain scan with this module, which means for every single subdomain of the domain specified here, run this module, which is very, very powerful feature of Nettacker, which, for example, doesn't exist in Nmap because you can't tell Nmap go and scan for ports the whole subdomain. So if I run this command, so what's going to happen now is Nettacker first going to discover all subdomains, and then it's going to connect to port 80 and 443 of each subdomain, and then check if there is anything in the server header. So you can see how quickly it performed that scan. You can see a lot of it is Cloudflare, but you can see there's something which is Global Edge Envoy. There's some Nginx in here, right? So there are some interesting results in there. So now I'm going to show you another feature of Nettacker where you can combine several modules. So I'm going to add another module, another scanning module, which is X powered by vulnerability. So now Nettacker is going to scan all the subdomains of OWASP.org for these two vulnerabilities. And they will, because they chain together, so they will be used together. So there you go. You will see that this scan will take a little bit longer than the previous one because obviously now there are two different modules which are being launched on the target. However, you can control the speed as I previously mentioned. And you can see already as the tool is running that there are some subdomains of our target which have this particular vulnerability. So, and we are now getting these results, which is very good. Okay, and now what I want to show you is you can see obviously when the attacker finishes working, the results are available in this basically text table format. However, if we read what the attacker says after it finishes the scan, it says the report saved, and then it gives me the HTML file name, which has basically the date, timestamp, and some random name, HTML, and database. So database is what makes Nettacker so unique because every single scan that you run stays in the database. By default, Nettacker uses SQLite database, which is built in, but you can configure it to use other databases such as MySQL or Postgres. And in the new version of Nettacker, which is going to be 004, we're looking to migrate to NoSQL database such as Redis, for example. So that is very important that it's in a database, but I want to show you the report. So look, it says report saved in this HTML file because it's HTML file, which means I can actually open it in a web browser. So we do have Firefox here on my Kali Linux. I can just launch it. And let's see if I can open this HTML file and see what is inside. Okay, let me go and open this file. Okay, and there you go. It's now loading our file. So once it's loading, you will see a very cool feature of Nettacker called penetration testing graph. This is what makes Nettacker so great. So it shows you that it starts the attack, then it's going through all the subdomains, and you can see all the modules that it runs on the target, and you can see all the responses from the various modules. So this is very, very cool. And you can see this graph or this tree. And the reason why is it's so useful because you can instantly spot, just based on the shape, some anomalies. For example, you can see that secure flag OWASP.org subdomain did not have the X powered by vulnerabilities. So it did not respond to X powered by. It only responded to server version vuln, but there was no X powered by. Or for example, other subdomains, they did have X powered by header return, and we can see that, for example, this one was a rank sense, and there are some others here as well. So this is what is making Nettacker is so cool. It's the um, this penetration testing graph, and there are various types of graphs that you can also use. And at the bottom of the report, you will find the same results of the scan in tabular format. So you can see what host was contacted, and there's a bit of a visual effect. So if I select a particular row, it will blur everything else. So you can see that training OWASP.org had port 80 open, and the server version vuln returned Cloudflare, and expired by returned rank sense. So, and you can see the date and time when it was scanned. There are two columns here which are currently empty, username and password. These are used for brute forcing attacks. So if you perform brute forcing scans, username and password will show the credentials which worked, the ones which let the user in and they allowed the user to log in into their backend system. So these are the vulnerable credentials. So that is how it works. Let me now return back to the presentation so I can talk further about Nettacker. We've seen already that we can perform module chaining, which is very, very good. You can chain several modules. However, you can also create profiles, and profiles are basically lists of modules that you want to chain together. You can create your own custom ones. However, the tool comes with a few of these profiles predefined, and these are info for obviously all the information gathering modules, scan for all the vulnerability scanning, brute for all the brute forcing modules, vuln for the vulnerability specific modules. There are also three more generic profiles. There's one called WP for WordPress. So this will run all WordPress specific modules on the target. If you know that your target is running WordPress, you can just run this to find all the WordPress related vulnerabilities. There's another one for Joomla, and that's for Joomla content management system. And there's a one magic profile called all, which will run absolutely all modules on your target. Of course, that means that the scan will be quite a slow one. It will take some time, but of course that will allow you to discover absolutely everything that Nettacker is possibly able to discover. If you want to launch Nettacker with a profile, then you will define your target as always using -i parameter or -l if you want to use a file name, and --profile, and then you specify the name of the profile. So that's how easy it is. I think I already showed you the demo of the graph. So these are the very cool feature of Nettacker. It's the outputting graph. And another great feature of Nettacker that the reports are available in also HTML, JSON, and CSV format. And CSV format is very important. Why? Because CSV is a spreadsheet, and everyone loves spreadsheets. They love spreadsheets. So you get a spreadsheet. Nettacker is probably one of the only open source and free security scanning tools that I know that you can launch within just minutes, very quick to download or run it from the container. And within minutes, you can get a spreadsheet which will contain all the assets or your network, all the hosts, all the subdomains, with all the open ports that they have, with a description of all the service that they're running, all the programming language that they're running, any, if you use brute forcing module, any vulnerable credentials, and you put it all in one spreadsheet, which is of course very, very useful. Let me show you how easy it is to generate the report in a spreadsheet.
Sam, can I just
Yep.
ask you a quick question? You know,
Yep.
the alternative of the spreadsheet, which is the graph, have anybody tried to send that JSON file into Elastic, for example?
Yeah. So of course you can use Elastic as well. And this is why you can have a JSON output. So JSON is very useful because you can then um, use the output of the attacker for with other tools, right? So because it's a structured format, so it can be used with Elastic and can be used with other security tools which will consume JSON, which is very, very cool.
Yeah, I was gonna say, but it'd be good if somebody else tried it, because Elastic sometimes you need to have the JSON in a particular format, but if you can have it in a nice way, it
Yeah.
gives you immediately a huge amount of visualization and dashboarding, which is pretty awesome.
Exactly, and that's what a lot of people are doing. And of course, with JSON format, you can actually quite easily transform it to whichever format you want, including the format which is which can be used with Elastic. So if you want to create, obviously, when I was running this by default, it was creating HTML reports. So look how easy it is to create a JSON or CSV report. So there's a -O or the output command line switch, and then I can just name my report file whatever I want. So if I, as an extension, I choose JSON, Nettacker will create a report in JSON format, and if I choose CSV, it will create a report in CSV format. So I'm just going to rerun the same command that I ran before. So it's going to go and discover all the subdomains, perform port scan on 2 ports, on port 80 and 443, and then discover if there are server banners being leaked or uh, any programming languages or technologies being leaked. And you can see now it is saved in report.csv file. I have LibreOffice, which is a free version of Office installed on my Kali Linux here. So let me see if I can open and show this to you in a real life spreadsheet. So there you go. That's LibreOffice loading. And you can see that I have just performed a security scan of the entire OWASP.org subdomain, OWASP.org domain. We've discovered all the subdomains, all the open ports, and we now have it all in a nice spreadsheet. There you go. There is one extra column in that spreadsheet, which is scan ID. Basically, every single scan when it's stored in the database has this unique ID. And obviously, this is used so later on, if you need to find out everything which was identified by a particular scan, you can. For example, we don't need it here. I can just hide it. But you can see this is our spreadsheet. And just like any sort of spreadsheet, of course, the advantage of spreadsheet format, love it or hate it. But what you can do with spreadsheets, of course, you can use them for filtering, and you can very quickly go. And as a manager, you have the spreadsheet, and go and say, okay, show me everything which is running on port 80. And you can go and say, there you go. These are all my assets on OWASP.org, which are running on port 80. And I can go and say, okay, show me everything which is running Nginx, right? So which subdomains on my network are running Nginx? There you go, straight away. I found out that this is secure flag. So this is why it's useful. And of course, Dennis, you're absolutely right. If you use this with something like Elastic, you will get some very nice visualizations out of the JSON format. So there you go. That is a very, very cool, important feature. When I presented Nettacker, I think in Black Hat 2019, I had a IT manager, a very large charity based in London, approaching me and saying big thank you because they use Nettacker on the network, and that helped them to discover all the assets. And of course, they discovered a vulnerable server. And they did it all for free. And as a charity, I was very thankful that this kind of tool exists. So if you know Jeremiah Grossman is our application security industry veteran, and is also the CEO and founder of the company called White Hat. And he's one of the guys who basically launched the whole application security as a concept back 20 years ago. So he tweeted back in 2017 when we were supposed to release our OWASP Top 10 2017. And Jeremiah basically tweeted this proposal. He said, I suggest that OWASP Top 10 2017 includes A0 or asset inventory. These days, the biggest AppSec risk are websites you don't know you own. Why? Because if you don't know what you own, you cannot possibly secure it. And it is still true today as a consultant. If I go to organizations and I tell them, do you know what you have? Do you know all your subdomains, all your servers? Do you know open ports? Do you know what is running on them? They will say, No, we don't. And we have now a free tool from OWASP, an open source project, which will help you which will help you with this task. Another cool thing about Nettacker that it also has an API and web UI. So if you want to use a web UI, you need to launch it with a dash dash start API parameter. And it's very important that it has this API key. So you will need to use this to authenticate. This is what the web UI looks like. I'll try to show this to you in my live demo. Let me switch back to my Kali Linux where I have my Nettacker. So instead of doing all these various parameters, I'm now going to launch Nettacker dash dash start dash API. So what now will happen, Nettacker has a built-in web server running Flask. And so there's a bit of warning. So it's a development server. Don't use it in production deployment because it's Flask. And you can see this API key, and I'm going to copy it. And you can see it says that it's running on, by default, it's running on localhost port 5000, but you can configure it to run on any IP address or port you want in your environment, of course. So because it is, of course, a web UI, let me launch Firefox and show you what it looks like. Okay, let's see if Firefox launches. There you go. We have our Firefox here. Let me maximize it. Of course, first we looked at our graph. So I'm going to go to HTTPS 127.0.0.1 port 5000. There you go. We will get the certificate warning because by default the certificate is self-signed. But of course, if you're running it in your environment, you can install a properly signed SSL certificate. For now, I'm going to accept the risk and continue. And what's going to happen now, Firefox is going to load up the web UI of OWASP Nettacker. It looks a bit like this. So we are actually working on getting the UI improved, but you get a few buttons. So you get tutorial, crawler, results, new scan, and there's a field to enter your API key. So for example, if I click on results, you will see that I can't do this because it will tell me please log in first. And actually the only button I can click on is tutorial, which will just walk you through all the various elements of the user interface. But to log in, I have to paste my API key. And once I paste it and set session, it will say, okay, we are now in there. So if I click on the results button, you will now see that every single scan that I performed in my demonstration is actually stored because it's all in a database. And all the scan results are here, which is absolutely fantastic. And if we want to see them, I can just click on one of the scan results and get the same familiar graph with all the results, and they're all here. So they didn't disappear, they're all here. And of course, there's another cool thing because they're in a database, we can actually search. So if I go back to my menu and click on crawler, we have a little filter. So this is where you can basically Google your search results. Why is this cool? That means that you can use OWASP Nettacker a bit like your internal shutdown tool. So you can discover what you have in your infrastructure and then search for particular vulnerability or for a port number. So for example, as far as I remember, we had on OWASP.org, one of the subdomains had Nginx running on it. So if I do search for Nginx, there you go, you will see that it's secureflag.owas.org. That was the one which had Nginx. And if I search for Cloudflare, you will see, hopefully here, these are all the subdomains using Cloudflare. So that was owas.org, videos, Kerala, mail, Google Apps, and lots of others. Yeah. And it's a very simple search, but again, it's powerful because you can basically go and search all your previous scans and all the results from all the previous scans. This is what makes it really, really cool. And the same thing, if we go to our results from our previous scans, you will also see, for example, let me go and show you something like a subdomain scan that we perform. Remember when we're looking for a subdomain scan, I can click on the get JSON button to download the JSON file or get CSV to download the CSV file. So even though I didn't run that scan as a CSV scan, the file is now available and I can open it as a spreadsheet, which is really, really cool. So which means I can go back. There you go. These are all our subdomains and all the data that we have available in in a spreadsheet format from a previous scan. So we can also start scans from Nettacker. So if you click on new scan, there's a bit of UI where you can go and define your target. So if I'm going to say, for example, OWASP.org, you can define several targets if you want. And here are all the various profiles. For example, if I click on brute, see it highlights all the brute forcing modules. The vulnerability will highlight all the vulnerability scanning modules, or I can cherry pick and basically say which particular modules I want to use, right? For example, these two. And if I go to the advanced screen, I can tick the check subdomains. And here's where you can see all the various thread numbers that I can configure. And also, if I'm using any brute forcing, the username and password dictionaries can be defined here as well. Another interesting thing about Nettacker, it can work through a SOX proxy as well. So if you are behind the proxy server, you are still able to scan. So there you go. Once this is all defined, I can click on submit, and it basically sends it to the API. You can see that's the actual API request being sent. And now this scan will be performed in the background. And once it is ready, we can go back to the results and keep on reload the page. And once the result is ready, it will appear in the list of scans so we can access it. So that's uh, there you go. It's now available. You can see scan number 11 is here, and you can see the difference between, for example, this scan and scan number 10 is this one was scanned through the OWASP Nettacker API. You can actually see that it was API that was used, while this one was scanned using command line. So again, if we want to go and check out the results of the scan, we just click on it, and we get the same nice looking graph. And we have the same table. And if we want to download it as a spreadsheet, we can go back and click on CSV for spreadsheet or JSON for JSON. So there you go. That is how cool this is. That's the API. I'm going to talk about a serious vulnerability which was affecting a lot of people last year, and that was the Microsoft Exchange proxy logon vulnerability, because there was a Chinese cyber attacker group called Hafnium, which exploited this vulnerability. And we, as OWASP project, OWASP Nettacker project, we were probably one of the first in the world to provide a free tool, because we created a module for scanning this for this vulnerability, and anyone in the world could actually use Nettacker to scan and find this particular vulnerability. I received a couple of thanks from 2 European countries, CERT, SOC. So basically, they computer emergency response teams thanking us as the project leaders, because they said that these countries' authorities, they scanned all the IP addresses within those countries, and they found numerous organizations running vulnerable versions of Microsoft Exchange, and they contacted them to get that patched. So this was very, very nice. And if you want to scan for proxy logon vulnerability with Nettacker, it's very simple. You just define the network that you want to scan and that module. That's it. And you can scan, of course, all the networks in your organization, or you can scan all the networks in your country if you know all the IP ranges of all the networks in your country. So that's how powerful this tool is. So I'm going to finish soon. So just going to summarize by highlighting some Nettacker use cases. So you can use it for asset discovery. You can scan your network for open ports. You can find what hosts you have on the network. You can scan your whole network to see what responds to default credentials, for example, admin, or any other default credentials that you specify. You can scan the whole network for a specific vulnerability. For example, as I showed you, Microsoft Exchange CVE. You can monitor your subdomains and open ports on them. Why is it important? In these days of DevOps, many developers will spin up some virtual machines in the cloud and then forget about them. And then, do you know what is running, belonging to your organization? You can use Nettacker to discover. One great use case is to discover expired SSL certificates, and also find subdomains hosting vulnerable version of content management systems. So there's another top 10 a part of your standard OWASP top 10. There's a GitHub top 10, which is based on the top 10 most starred repos. And I'm pleased to report that OWASP Nettacker is now among all the OWASP projects, is now a number 10 in OWASP GitHub project top 10 with the most number of stars. And the star on GitHub usually means that users either save them for the in the list of favorites, or they just express that they like the project. So it's a bit of a like. So you'll also be surprised to see that, for example, OWASP top 10 is not the most starred OWASP GitHub repo. The most popular, most starred GitHub repo is Cheat Sheet series. So that was a really cool thing to discover. One cool thing about version 003 that the modules are now defined using YAML. So you no need to use Python to write modules. You can define the module using YAML format. Here on the right, you can see an example of a YAML module looking for a F5 networks vulnerability. And you can see this is various attack paths. And this is a regex, which expects, in this particular case, a root line from etc password, which means the target is vulnerable to this remote code execution vulnerability. And you can see you don't need to program, you can just define it all in YAML, which is really, really cool. And then how to contribute, we have developer section on our wiki. We welcome all contributions. Please do read and follow contributor guidelines. If you know Python, you can contribute code, but you don't have to be a coder, a programmer to contribute to any open source project. You can help us with translations. Currently, Nettacker is translated to a few languages, but not enough. So if you speak a particular language, you can check if we don't have a translation. You can add your language or do a proofreading to see if previous translation is correct, or help us out with documentation. And of course, if you use this tool daily in your job and you find any issues, any bugs, you can just raise them on GitHub. So this is it. So that's Nettacker. You can go and attack your network before the real attackers do. So thank you very much. You can contact me at SecureStep9 on Twitter or sam.stepanyan@owasp.org. I'm not sure if we have time for questions because I think we're at the top of the hour. Let me see. Right. Can you please share slides once you finish?
In case,
yeah.
Oh, Petra.
Yeah.
Make Petra
yeah.
co-host.
Go for it. Yeah. Petra.
My other one was just CI integration.
That was my question as well. Like, how could you automate that? Like, maybe do you have a Docker version?
Yes, we do have a Docker version, and because it's also command line, and because the tool is written in Python, I think every single CI/CD pipeline tool that I know, like GitHub Actions or Azure DevOps or TeamCD will run Python, so you can just run it using command line and install it on your build agent, or you can just run it in a Docker. So the Docker container is available, and it's very fast and quick and very useful.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam.
And we do have teams who use it in the CI/CD pipelines to go and, for example, check for open ports, and just to make sure that whatever they deploy in the environment, there are no other open ports apart from, for example, port 443. Or you can use it for any other purpose, for example, discover all the subdomains and notify administrators if there is a new subdomain created that your IT administrators know nothing about. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Brilliant, man. Cool.